quickly, by way of introduction to me, I'm Kevin Legg. I'm the managing partner at Sage. And Sage is a specialty firm that specializes in advice and consulting, technology and data, as well as learning and training for business development, particularly for startup businesses and professional services firms. So what we do from time to time when we come across people who are just great, they communicate well, they're unique ideas, is we want to get them in this venue. So every 6 or 8 weeks or so, and increasingly on a more regular pace, we have a webinar. And for that reason, I'm very pleased to have, as this webinar's guest, Dave Glynn. I'll maybe say 1 or 2 words of intro, but I will leave some of the detail to Dave around his background. But you know, B2B leaders always espouse a land and expand view when it comes to their sales, and yet not too many of them have actually been at the cutting edge and the frontier of land and expand campaigns for the kind of duration or tenure that that Dave Glynn has. So for about little over 12 years, Dave has spent that whole time executing not only his own land and expand tactics and strategies, but teaching others to do land and expand strategies, and in particular, what we're going to talk about today, which is subscription renewals. So Dave is the head of business development at Expert Institute, and you can check him out there or on LinkedIn. But without a single further ado, Dave, as they say in radio and television, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Kevin, and thank you everyone for sharing your lunch hour with me. I am speaking to you from Bangor, Maine in the States. It is 11:30 p.m., but I am sprightly and ready to go. I have my coffee here. I'll give a little bit of background on me and then let you know the structure of this presentation. I'm originally from the States, Boston area. I spent about 4 years or so actually working with Kevin in a previous life in Singapore for GLG, Gerson Lehrman Group, primarily servicing financial institutions, hedge funds, private equity funds, investment banks, long onlys. After having some good success in Singapore, Southeast Asia, India, Australia, I moved back stateside, spent some time in New York City with GLG at the headquarters there. Shortly thereafter, about a year or so after the New York return, I moved over to my current role, which is head of business development at Expert Institute. I think one of the reasons why Kevin and Stephen reached out to me and asked me to present this evening is my long-term experience with subscriptions, and in particular with Expert Institutes. I was luckily and fortuitously able to implement a subscription model. So about 6 years or so ago, when I joined Expert Institute, we had something in the ballpark of 10 employees or so just off of Wall Street, and worked in and exclusively delivered our services in a transactional pay-as-you-go, one and done type of model. We deliver a great product. I joined and said, look, the model is wrong. Subscriptions is the appropriate way to go. It took about 5 or 6 months for me to figure out the ins and outs, the nuances of how to position it. Ultimately, it worked. We just passed 170 employees or so, and about 6 years ago, like when I had started, we had 0 firms under contract. We just passed 750 firms under contract. So I like to think that we got it right. There's always room for improvements, but it's been one of, if not the most rewarding parts of my professional career. My current role, our core clientele is law firms. We primarily work with plaintiffs' personal injury firms, but of course, some of the themes that all of us are regularly encountering on the sales front are transferable, ubiquitous, really across any industry that you can imagine. So that's a little bit about me. I'll give you a quick overview of the structure of this presentation. So I'll kick things off with kind of the permeating grand overarching theme, and that is the long-term view while still seizing short-term opportunities. Subscriptions by definition are long-term. It's transactions or one-offs or pay-as-you-go ad hoc work, by definition, is short. It is not the long-term view. So there are certainly concessions that we need to make as salespeople who are perpetuating a subscription model, sometimes in the short term, not always hitting a home run or getting the optimal outcome. But the idea is that a long-term mutually palatable relationship is something that proves to be as lucrative as possible for all parties involved. So that's the theme to kind of keep in the back of your minds. The next section, and I'll kind of just jump into it now, it will be talking about 3 things that I ask myself going into every renewal, every negotiation, even an initial sales pitch. And those 3 things are, 3 objectives are: protecting against the least desirable outcome. What can I do to ensure that we don't have the worst outcome? Historically, or typically, I should say, that is the firm, the clients, opting not to continue the service, discontinuing and going your separate ways. So what can we do to protect against that? The next is creating the path for the optimal outcome. What is the ideal home run? We nailed it. We got as much money as we could. How do we kind of lubricate that path to ensure that we have the opportunity, even if we don't achieve that goal? But how can we make sure that it is a possibility for any given discussion or negotiation? And then the third question that I'm always asking myself is, how can I make the path for the easiest or for the best, most likely outcome? How can we ensure that? I'll then briefly talk about preparation, some best practices, sort of tips of the trade, tricks of the trade to ensure that all 3 of those questions are satisfactorily answered. I'll then move into timing. I have a different slide up here. Kevin, if you don't mind resending the last version of the deck, I have one that's a little bit outdated. Timing will be the next section, so we can determine whenever we would like to have these conversations. There are certain benefits that we have as far as being the ones who can initiate the conversation. 9 times out of 10, we're in the driver's seat when determining what the sequence is going to be, we as salespeople. And then finally, there'll be just a little bonus round of kind of best practices, tips that I have found over my 12 plus years to be really valuable. And I trust that a few of these will likely stick with you, and hopefully you can take them away and employ them in your day-to-day. So number 1, I will talk about how to avoid, or one of the first step, avoiding the least desirable outcome. Kevin, is that one that
Dave, just so you know what I'm sharing, I'm just putting your slides up here. So I've got your protecting least desirable outcome up.
Got it. Thank you. I can see that here. Can you flip to the next one, or is the next one? Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so opportunities for growth. In order to avoid the least desirable outcome of I want to discontinue the service, one of the core things to be communicating is I expect, or we envision, or we typically see firms, clients, outfits like yours continue to grow with us. So often when I'm encountering folks who want to discontinue any relationship or service or a subscription, they're communicating, hey, I just didn't use the service enough, or I'm not getting the commensurate value. It is critical, in my opinion, to be communicating to them. I suspect you may have derived some value from the service. However, where I see most firms like yours go is engaging some of these other services. So the opportunity for growth, we expect, or it is very reasonable to expect that you will use the service more. It might be looking at data points, things such as, well, 7 out of your 10 employees have used the service. Well, that's a great point to make. There's a communication there that 3 out of the 10 have not yet used the service. So there is a likelihood for us to grow. Perhaps they have not used all of the products. That's a critical thing to be communicating as well. I so often, when I have these these conversations, see folks saying, well, I use you for this and I find it to be a value, but I don't know if that can justify the expense. What I really like to do is throw as many things at the wall and see how many of them can stick. Ideally, if you communicate 5 different ways of using your service or 10 different ways of using the service, starts to open up the mind a little bit to say, you know, I could see that that would be valuable for me. I could see how I could use the service in that manner. The next is cultivating multiple contacts. So frequently, if we have a primary engager or a primary user or consumer of our service, our options are limited. If that person or that individual has an unsatisfactory experience, then you're kind of handcuffed. It makes it a very difficult negotiation, or makes it difficult to have a compelling, persuasive argument to continue. And of course, it makes it difficult to make an argument to expand the agreement. And ideally, of course, that's the goal. We want these things to grow over time. When we have multiple contacts, it really just multiple consumers of the service really allows us to manipulate much more data, to allow us to structure a variety of different arguments to really put things in a compelling manner. You can pull 1, 2, 3 anecdotes from each individual user. It just provides so many more arrows in the quiver. So critical to be cultivating multiple contacts, multiple folks who are using the service. The next is buying time, preemptive, definitive, negative resolution. What I frequently will do when I have an initial discussion and they say, hey, I am not going to continue the service, allow for an opportunity to re-engage in the future. You're not going to win all the time. There are certainly folks, no matter what you do, who are going to discontinue the service. I always recommend when I'm preaching to my teams, and there's about 15 folks on one, 10 or so on the other. One's a customer success account management team. The other's a pure sales team. But whenever we get a negative response, particularly over email, I do not intend to continue the service. It is so critical to be having a phone conversation, or ideally a meeting with that person, which is of course challenging in the COVID days. Hopefully there's a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. However, I have found when we have these discussions, usually we can end this thing on a positive note that allows the door to remain open for the future. So the definitive negative resolution, what I'm referring to there is somebody sends an email that says, I've reviewed the contract, I've discussed it with my team, we made the decision not to continue. I like to reach out in those situations and say, well, if we're going to be parting ways professionally for the time being, I'd be grateful to have a brief conversation with you. I wanted to share some parting thoughts. We've been appreciative of the opportunity to serve you. Do you mind if we circle up and kind of shake hands virtually for 5 or 10 minutes? I have found that this is a productive way to discontinue, but also to leave the door open. It is very rare that folks, if you've been working with them and they know that you've committed yourselves to delivering a valid and valuable service to them, it is rare for them to say no to that. And then you allow yourself the opportunity to speak with them 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. It doesn't really matter how long it is, but if you're communicating to them, I'm appreciative of the opportunity to service you. Do you mind if I reach out to you in a month, 2 months, 3 months, just to touch base? I know that we're continuing to expand in the marketplace. Perhaps we intend to have some new products roll out. I value the relationship with you. It has meant a lot to serve you during this period, and I'm hopeful that we'll have the opportunity in some form or another to do so in the future. Again, extremely rare for that kind of light, gentle, professional, appreciative language to be received with a negative response. And then 2 months down the road, 6 months down the road, a year down the road, all of a sudden your email is coming from a warm and fuzzy place in the recollection of the client. They were calling that last call where you weren't pushy, you weren't a jerk, you shook hands professionally, you handled it like a gentleman or a gentlewoman. The response is much greater. And I have absolutely won back accounts where if we had just accepted their email decline, and responded with, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Let us know if you change your mind," that never leads anywhere. That never gets anywhere. It is not a priority for them to keep you front of mind and come back in 3 months and say, "Hey, I changed my mind. Things are new." It's your and our responsibility as salespeople to leave the electricity at least going a little bit so that we can re-engage the dialogue with some vigor and have some receptivity from the client side.
So that's super interesting, David. Like when you say that, usually when you're calculating lifetime value of an account, it's like when they drop, that's it. That's the end of that life. But I think you kind of take a slightly more holistic view. You could have a lifetime value where they're not a client for a period of time. They come back, they are a client again. I mean, I know you have some other tactics as well to let them go to just barely hanging by a thread and a lifeline just to keep that live. But if I'm hearing you, right in the expert institute context, maybe some of the way you're talking about the team, somebody leaving, you never really want that to sort of be the end of LTV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the benefits of at least resolving or making a pivot to the future with kind of an affable parting of ways, it just opens up things for a variety of other doors and windows that are more often than not unforeseen. And those can be things like perhaps you get a referral from them. They leave with a nice note in their mind or a nice tone or perspective of you of this guy handled my bad news to him very well. I'm comfortable communicating to other folks, hey, it's worth speaking with Kevin. It's worth speaking with Dave. They're professionals and, they're reasonable people to be dealing with. So absolutely. That's kind of, I can count dozens of times where taking that one additional step of having that conversation, it's so worth it when you think about the time that you put into a relationship, crafting up emails, going through a 6-month contract or a 12-month, or servicing them, perhaps meeting them, training them on the services. You put a lot of damn effort into this thing. So take that extra step and just have that conclusive call with them. It's absolutely worth it for the time that you've invested thus far, regardless of if they're discontinuing.
So there's one other thing I just wanted to pick up here, because we had a bit of debate and discussion about it some time ago, and I thought people might like to sort of get enfranchised on that debate discussion. Cultivating multiple contacts. This, in some sense, this kind of runs counter to having a key decision maker and keeping the discussion, the negotiation clean.
It does. It does. And there are, I think, a variety of different factors to be looking at to see if you want to expand that audience outside the one individual who's your primary guy or the primary decision maker. You have to make an evaluation of if it's just one it's really weighing, do I have just one individual who's really using the service or who is the primary decision maker? Does that get me to where I want to be, which is in most cases probably having a lucrative contract? Or is it worth expanding it out to other folks? That, of course, runs the risk that if you do not deliver the goods to them, that they're going to have negative feedback when there is an internal convention or conference about what to do next steps. So it's, there are a variety of factors that play into it. I generally am looking at seniority. I'm also really keeping a close handle and kind of manipulating the relationship in such a way that I want those who are engaging our service to have the optimal experience. So maybe there are certain products that I'm really pushing to one associate as opposed to a partner, an executive director, or managing director. Everybody's got a different role. There are, of course, general silos, and there's a general hierarchy and some continuity across different levels. But if you think about it, it's really simple of just putting yourselves in their shoes. So I'm always thinking about the client and how are they going to make this decision as to, am I going to continue? Am I going to discontinue? If I continue, am I going to push and negotiate to remain flat, or am I going to try to expand the relationship? Put yourselves in their shoes. How are they going to make that decision? Is there a weekly meeting where everybody sits in the room and all the voices are heard, is even from the underlings? Is it the 2 or 3 partners who oversee the 20 or 25 individuals who are at the firm? So that's the core audience. what is going to be most compelling to those that are making that decision, and really structuring the service and your arguments to convince the majority or all of those that you can who weigh in and have an impact on what the outcome is.
Yeah.
I was thinking of one example. I have one client in the state of Connecticut, a law firm, Edelman Hirsch. And this first question really came out, these tactics had a very positive impact. They worked like a charm, so to speak. They had communicated to me after doing a 6-month trial period, look, we think you deliver a good product. We're not displeased of the work that you rendered on our behalf, but we didn't use the service that much. We had a couple projects that we did with you that didn't quite blow us away. Our business has slowed down during COVID. Look, I don't think it's a good time for us to be continuing with you. They did communicate that to us. What I did in that scenario was, going into that conversation, I had an inkling that that would likely be their desired outcome and what they wanted to do for next steps. So I absolutely employed all of these tactics that I've been talking about. I talked to them about growth. So going through those bullet points, talked to them about growth and said, look, you're just going through the first period. What we typically see after contract 1 is an expansion of the services and an expansion of the use of our service. It is normal. It takes a little bit of getting to know one another. There's certainly a familiarization period. It takes a little bit for us to get integrated into your workflow. Everybody wants to be part of the cool club. And when you're communicating that other members of the cool club are in the same boat as you, or they started the same way as you, some of them had those same initial concerns and objections, but believe me, trust me, you believe I'm a reasonable, fair business guy, right? What I've seen all these other folks do is really start to steadily expand. They slowly find out that they like this service or that service. So that is what I expect to happen with you. That happens 9 times out of 10. And that's a difficult argument to hear and to say, well, that's invalid and doesn't make sense. There might be short rebuttals. There might be some pushback to that, but you know your service better than the client does. You have the data to back that up. They cannot refute or disprove that. It's probably true in most instances. I'd be careful about speaking without truth. Of course, we want to be honorable and honest with our clients. But in most subscription businesses, there is a familiarization period. So comfort them with that. And I did comfort this firm, Edelman Hirsch, with that, and they were receptive to that. I also reached out a little bit early when starting this conversation with them, and we did activate 2 other users at the firm. We realized that this was likely going to be one of their counter arguments and contributing factor to opting to discontinue. In order to preempt that, we deliberately mobilized our research folks, who are the ones who actually deliver our product in my business and industry, and said, look, can you reach out as good cop? You're the one who delivers the product. You're valuable and an asset to these folks. I'm the money guy. Let's not blur the lines between our 2 roles. I'm the one going to and asking for more loot. You're the one who's delivering the goods here. Can you reach out and let them know some of the ways that you're supporting their colleagues and peers? We did that successfully. 2 more folks started to use the service shortly after they communicated they were inclined to discontinue. Those 2 folks made a very significant impact. They actually got them up to their quota that the contract entitled them to. And then lastly, I did employ the not allowing for a definitive negative resolution, a little bit different than how I had laid it out in kind of a theoretical way earlier, which is shaking hands and parting ways, but leaving with warm and fuzzies. Instead, I did a little bit of a permutation of that and saying, look, I understand your concerns. If you want to discontinue, you're the ones who pay us. You're absolutely the one who makes that decision. We'd love to continue with you, but if you'll just allow me to circle back with my team internally, I have been thinking about you, and there are a few ideas I'd like to share and present to you. Will you allow me to do that with it in mind that it is your inclination to discontinue? They did say sure. Then I think that sure was primarily just out of respect and that we've been fair business people to them. But that sure really opened up a door for another opportunity for me to dissuade them from continuing. I came back with a couple of suggestions. One of those was a refresher training session. Another one was to have somebody come into their office and really go through a review of all of their needs and talk about how the service can be tailored to them. So those three things were employed: communicating the opportunities for growth, engaging or activating a couple of users who had previously been dormant, and then coming back with a few suggestions as to how we can maximize their utility and what they derive from the service. Those things worked. And this was about a month and a half ago or so. And there was probably a 2-week period in between when they said they were discontinuing to when we managed to pull a 180 about face. They did continue the service. They actually increased by about 10% because we offered them some favorable terms to expand. And that growth argument really was compelling to them. And they said, oh, everybody else grows with you after the first contractual period. It's normal for us to have maybe a couple bumps in the road and not utilize it to its fullest capacity. Okay, that makes me feel good. And you're extending favorable terms to compensate for that growth. Okay, let's give this thing a shot. It worked.
Okay, so thinking about we're coming up on halftime, but just thinking about that. So that's once again, that's the negative case. So you take into consideration what's the sort of worst thing that could happen. Let's not have that happen. And then you have not necessarily ensuring an optimal case, but at least planning for it. Yeah.
Yep, that's the next, creating a path for an optimal outcome. So I'll move through this a little quicker. 2 big bullet points for creating path for optimal outcome. Of course, have what that optimal outcome is. What is the big win that you want to get? What is the dollar amount? What is the contract size? And those 2 tactics to allow that path to be lubricated and easy to achieve are: 1, clearly communicating the benefits of going big. So here's why it's attractive to you, clients. And then the other is safety net. So if we go big and for whatever reason it doesn't turn out the way that I'm telling you I expect it to and that I've seen it to, here's why it will still be okay. So for the clearly communicating the benefits of going big, similar to the fear of missing out, FOMO, communicating anecdotes with competitors. This is what I have seen your peers and competitors doing. Those 3 words, peers and competitors, have a lot of robust, tangible receptions that you get when communicating them. Again, everybody wants to be part of the cool club. Another benefit or another way to lubricate that path to the optimal outcome, talking to them about additional products. I kind of touched on that in the beginning, but here are some other ways that we see folks who get the most value from the service. They have done contracts like this and taken this step, and now look at the success that they're having. They've expanded dramatically with us, and it has made a very significant impact on their bottom line. The next is just the human element to it. I oftentimes, in just a kind of a one-on-one conversation, try to communicate to them, look, you're going to look like a rock star once this thing gets confirmed. Everybody likes to look like a rock star. Everybody wants to be slapped on the back. If it's somebody who's lower in the ranks, they want their bosses to come to them and say, thank you for spearheading that negotiation. It's working out really well. Similarly, bosses want to make as much money as they can. And when they make a decision to continue or expand with you, it reflects really well on them. It builds up their credibility. It buys the loyalty from their team. They look good. So communicate to them the upside of how good they are going to look should this thing work out the way you expect it to, and the way your experience has dictated it usually does work out. The competitive element as well. Again, there's sort of derivations of the fear of missing out, but if you have nice saturation in a marketplace, or there are some keynote names that you have signed on to contracts, there's a competitive advantage that those folks have. Communicate that. If you're in an industry where you can talk about your clients and actually name them, then great, drop their names. In my previous life in GLG, there was a lot of confidentiality, so there really wasn't an opportunity, albeit a word on the street was pretty transparent of who was working with who. But when you can drop names and talk about folks who use your service that are known to have had success, regardless of if it's tied directly to your service or not, they're clearly making good decisions, and those decisions are enviable and copied, 2 points for stealing from their competitors in the space. So you, client, are putting yourself at a disadvantage as opposed to these other folks who are using our service and kicking butt in the marketplace. And then the last, I really, for the clearly communicating the benefits of going big, I love doing this next one, this final one. Communicating to them, again, putting yourselves in their shoes. Look, I recognize that I am asking or proposing expanding this thing dramatically. I know that's a lot more money. This is normal. We normally do see a big jump between contract 1 and 2 or contract 2 and 3. Relax, we recognize it. This does not go on in perpetuity. We're not expecting to expand you 50%, 100% in perpetuity. But in order to get you to where you get the most out of the service, this is what we're proposing. And this is what we have done with so many other firms, folks, and clients with great success. So you're not going to be having a heavy hit in your bank accounts as far as the eye can see in the future, but it does take a jump at this point in order to get to where you should be. So that's clearly communicating the benefits of going big. And then the safety net that I'm an advocate for communicating is, should you go big with us, and if it doesn't work out, it's still going to be okay for a few different reasons. One of those reasons may be, or one of the solutions you may have, and I employ this with great regularity as well, is maybe we'll just extend out the period for a couple of months or 6 months or 2 months, whatever it is. Send us whatever projects you have. We envision working with you for many years to come. It's not a money grab. It's not a bank heist. We don't want to get as much money as quickly as we can and then part ways. Again, it harkens back to that pervasive theme of having a long-term view. So if you have the autonomy or the ability within your particular business to make that offer, it provides so much comfort to folks who feel like the spend is just something that is going to set them back, and there'll be no way to recapture it or recoup it or to make things right if it doesn't work out the way that you're communicating to them that it will. Secondarily, I frequently say, look, if you don't use the service to the extent that I am expecting you to based on this significant increase, we'll make sure we're fair on the next contract. I've done this with great regularity with many of our other clients. Maybe we roll over some of the fees that have been paid. Maybe we reduce the overall agreement. Again, clients, we want to work with you for years to come. There are peaks and troughs. Activity goes up and down. You will see, as we've seen from the vast majority of our clients, that activity generally normalizes over a lengthy period of time. We want to work with you through those ups and downs, and then we'll find that steady state. So that usually assuages a lot of concerns. And then it does allow them, when you present them with a couple of options, to go back internally and at least make a reasonably compelling argument for why they may want to go big. Of course, you should probably have some attractive commercial terms. You're buying in bulk. It's a bigger contract. It's cheaper per request or project, whatever it is. But when they're able to really succinctly communicate the safety net aspect of your proposal to their colleagues, it makes them feel good and provides comfort. All of these tactics, again, it's a case study I should have shared at the beginning of this section, but a very good client of ours, our largest client, actually, a law firm in Florida, they went from just kind of the perfunctory small contract to immediately the largest contract that we have in our entire firm. They grew by about 20 times from the first contract to the second contract. It was a huge victory. Final point on that, I probably should leave this for the bonus section, but I'll just put it here because I have it in my notes. Sometimes if you have the ability to do so or the autonomy to do so, it's a good tactic to let the firm overeat, meaning maybe they have, just for simple terms, a contract that entitles them to reach out 10 times, but they're rocking and rolling. They have a couple of engagements or projects with you that are close to coming through to fruition. You know, there's something else big that's coming down the pike that your firm is really well positioned to blow them out of the water. It may allow you to have more data and say, look, you've sent us this many requests. If we look at that as a run rate moving forward, you really should be spending X dollar amount. The reason why this can be attractive as well is if you communicate to them immediately, I had this conversation actually today with a client of ours, or with internally about a client of ours. I've found in certain circumstances that if you reach out to them right as they're reaching that cap or the expectation that's allowed for in a contract or under the terms that you agreed to, they can really ration out their final requests so they are not using the service before it's all, or consuming it to its entirety before the contract is up. It can really stifle the opportunity for growth, whereas we're going to let this firm that we were talking about today run with it. All of a sudden, they're going to have blown past it, and then we're going to be in a really nice position to go in and say, look, we didn't cut you off, but based on your current run rate, you should be spending 6x. And that's because we're going to allow these different projects to come in and not allow them the opportunity to ration it out and say, look, I used it just the way that the contract entitled us to. The next and third question is making the path easy for the best, most likely outcome. I have an example here of a good client of ours in Chicago. So there are 3 primary bullet points here. One, communicating to them that, look, it's going to be a pain in the ass and a headache for you if you determine that you do not want to continue with us or you want to reduce the contract. Your team is going to find that they have a void now. They're going to have to reach out to other service providers or other resources. They're going to have to get trained. There's going to be a familiarization period where wherever you're getting those resources from aren't accustomed to your preferences. It's going to be a hassle and something that you're bringing onto your own plate if you do not move forward with us and pursue this best, most likely outcome. So communicating to them their pains, their pain points that they can expect to have should they opt to not move forward. Additionally, the kind of akin to the refresher training that can be a nice way to get the optimal growth and also to prevent folks from discontinuing. But even more so, I find it to be most applicable to making the path for the best, most likely outcome. Saying to the client, here are some suggestions I can make to ensure you get the most out of the service. This is what I see your peers and competitors doing. I expect that you will follow this path. And lastly, just a very kind of subtle, I don't want to call it necessarily a trick, but this is actually a tactic that I kind of adopted from Kevin here, the gent hosting this, communicating with a sense of inevitability. We will provide a refresher. We will reach out on this day. We will contact these folks. We will have a very successful period with you. Communicating this sense of inevitability as opposed to, we'd love to continue and this is what we would do. That's hypothetical. That's conditional. It's a very subtle human perception, but communicating with inevitability. We will, this is what is going to happen. It makes a subtle impact and an imprint on their brains, and it makes it seem as if it's a much smoother, fluid transition forward for the best, most likely outcome.
Something I'd add in there is that, like so many kinds of communication, I think that does a great service to the salesman as well, or that salesperson, that rep, that account manager. When they speak with inevitability, they stop thinking in hypotheticals or maybes themselves, right? So of course it does something in the buyer. But the advocate, the person actually expressing all of these complex ideas and so forth, it just clears up their head a lot, just to say, not maybe, but when.
It does. Ditto and reinforced. The kind of, I guess I'm about 2/3 of the way through here. The next section is preparation. This, of course, could be a lecture in and of itself, but I wanted to distill it down to about 5 points that I think are most valuable and key takeaways, if there are some that you are taking from this presentation. Number 1, know the data inside out, certainly better than the clients. That is a weapon that you have, your knowledge of the data and your access to the data that the client does not have. It's an advantage for you, and use it. Manipulate the data to tell a favorable story. I wouldn't advocate being disingenuous, and the word manipulate can have that connotation. That's not what it's meant to communicate here. It's meant to be, you have all of these weapons and dominoes that you can line up in whatever order you choose. Use that to your advantage. A simple example of that may be if they're looking at data and saying, well, in the past 6 months, I used the service X times, that justifies this spend. Well, you can look and cut and slice the data and say, well, maybe the last 2 months they were really, really busy. Use that as your run rate as opposed to the 6 months. Look at the period. You can choose the start dates and end dates. That's just a nice example. Use that. Similarly with different users, maybe more users have used the service in the past month or 2 months as opposed to this previous period. Talk about that growth. Whatever has an upward trajectory line, that's a nice, compelling argument to be making. The next recommendation would be compiling perspectives from your colleagues on the account. You generally are, I'm assuming, the salesperson, the one who is talking about dollars and cents. You're not touching the account in most instances on a daily basis. Maybe your colleagues are, maybe the back end folks are, maybe they're not even on the phone. They're just pushing buttons or sending emails or sending over documents or reports, whatever your industry is. But they are inevitably going to have some anecdotes and experiences that are valuable to you. When the decision maker, when you're having that conversation with the decision maker, hears you talking about the work that his or her team has been doing with you, when you have some hard data, when you have some outcomes and anecdotes, he says, damn, or she says, damn, this individual, you are paying attention to our account. You're very familiar with the nuances, the users, the services being rendered and asked for. You care about the relationship. So compile the perspectives from your colleagues, because they inevitably are going to know stuff about the relationship that you don't, and you can be selective with what you use to make the compelling argument for your satisfactory renewal. I always advocate the next point of speaking with your allies at the client. Your ally may be the boss, but frequently you should, as I said earlier, be cultivating those other relationships. These folks are going to have great insights for you. I would recommend communicating with them even before you have the call set up to, or the meeting set up to conduct the renewal conversation. If you're building that rapport and cultivating the relationship over the period of the subscription, you're going to get some really valuable nuggets from them. They might say, you know, John, the managing director, just got divorced. He just got back from vacation. He just had a really big win. He just bought a house. He just bought 3 cars. Those types of nuggets that you get are going to be really, really valuable. I'm going to sound a little off the cuff and uncouth here, but I have many, many times in my experience found out that a client just had a kid. People are really happy when they just have kids and they don't negotiate that hard. Not necessarily to take advantage of it, but know your audience, know your clients. And when you get those anecdotes, I, without a doubt, have used that to my advantage. We're pleasant and communicate effectively, but they're in a mode in those instances where they're just putting things in perspective. They're happy to be having conversations. You will get those anecdotes and see your angles by speaking with your allies and getting some intelligence on what's going on behind their closed doors. The next is, of course, just diligence on your decision makers. Do your homework on them, whether it's LinkedIn, Googling, Google Alerts, again, speaking with allies at the firm. Perhaps you went to the same school, perhaps you're members of the same club, perhaps you played the same sport. Of course, it's always sales 101 to be building up rapport, but you may also get some insights into their personality, into how to position what you're asking for by just doing your diligence on them. The more information you have on those who are sitting on the other side of the table, clearly the better. And then lastly, kind of a compilation of these points, but anticipating objections and negative feedback. You're going to get some of that by speaking with your colleagues. You're going to likely get some of that by speaking with the allies at the firm, and you're going to get some of that just by doing your diligence and your homework on the accounts when you're going in to prepare. But it is a terrible situation. I can speak from experience, to be caught with your pants down, to be absolutely unaware that, oh, we're speaking at the end of the fiscal year. I didn't even know that. That's a terrible time for us to be having this conversation, or directly on the heels of their worst project or worst case or worst submission that they've had with you. You're able to anticipate objections when you follow these 4 bullet points and many others that we're not going to touch on today. But prepare for those negative pieces of feedback and objections. The next section here, and kind of final one before bonus, is timing. I've distilled this down to 4 points. I just touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation about you have the option 9 times out of 10 to choose when you're having this conversation. But in really simple terms, I'm always asking myself, and I'd encourage you to ask yourselves as well, when is the most attractive time to be having this conversation? And there's a variety of factors that go into that. Some of the things that go into that are perhaps their fiscal year. So when are they planning for their fiscal year? If they're already in the middle of the year and they've expended all their funds on resources and you and your competitors, well, they might not have a whole lot of money in their banks and their repository to be making a significant commitment to you. So if you can tailor or choose the time of your conversation to be perhaps when they're in the budgeting process, put yourself in their shoes once again, so you can get in on that budget. So factors that are outside of your control, be mindful of those. And those factors, again, one example is their fiscal year. Another might be, are they affected by COVID? Are they coming to the light at the end of the tunnel now? Does their business expect to expand? Time that conversation. Another recommendation there, bullet point 2 out of 4, is if you're questionable about if your contact is the guy, is the gal, is that the one that you really want to have, or should you try to have some other options? I always recommend starting the conversation a little bit earlier. If you determine after that initial conversation that they are not going to be an ally or collaborative, and they intend to be somebody who's an impediment or trying to get in the good graces of their boss by being a really challenging person to deal with and negotiating as hard as they can, perhaps you can have some other folks that you're speaking with. Perhaps you can then revisit your tactics, have different strategies. So again, to reiterate that, if you're not certain that your contact is the right person, or if they're going to be advocates enough to achieve or assist you in achieving the outcome that's reasonable, allow yourself enough time to change course. Similarly, testing the waters early. I really like to do this when timing, when starting a little bit early does not impede or act as an impediment or an obstacle to the outcome that I want to get. I really like to test the waters, and you can do so without the client even being aware. Some of the ways that I really like to do that is just reaching out over an email and saying, hey, do you have a few minutes to catch up next week? We're kind of approaching the end of the contract, or perhaps you're approaching the higher end of what the contract entitles you to, or I'd like to gather some of your feedback. Even just raising those kind of superficial, high level, not content heavy questions or thoughts, you're likely going to glean something from their response. Their response might be, I'm too busy right now, I don't have time to speak, but reach out in a couple of weeks. Well, maybe that's indicative that they're not really paying attention to the accounts. Maybe it's not a high priority for them. Maybe you can just slide right in and have a quick and easy conversation in a couple of weeks, or just present them with a proposal and go straight to the finish line. Alternatively, they might say, yes, I would like to set aside a full hour. I have some concerns and objections about our experience. Well, great. That's not the news that you want to hear. But of course, if you start that conversation early, all of a sudden, you know the tone that you're going to be facing when you get into the room, as opposed to, hey, do you have 30 minutes tomorrow? I'd like to catch up with you. That doesn't allow you the time to prepare, and it doesn't give you any indication as to what the attitude and demeanor is going in. Testing the waters early with kind of gray area, straight down the fairway type of language to solicit or elicit some sort of a response can be a really valuable tactic to employ.
Hey, Dave, I'm just looking that we got 10 minutes to go, and I want to make time for the bonus. I also want to give people a chance right now, in case they've had questions along the way, to start firing them in. So you can fire in questions into the chat. I'm watching that. I'll see that if you do it. But just a quick interlude, Dave. That was it. Just to let folks know that if they needed a question to Dave Glynn, they're going to get their chance now.
Yep. Thank you. I am verbose. Well, it's a nice interlude because I am into the final section here. So just some kind of bonus thoughts that I'd like to, thoughts from experience and observations. If there's anything for you to take away, hopefully there are some valuable nuggets that have been in here, but here are a couple more to kind of leave as parting thoughts. One, it's hard to sign clients up, and it's hard and a lot of work to have really long-term lasting relationships. So keep them on board once you've won them. Take that long-term view, even if it means going through a period where you're not making as much money on the relationship as you'd like, they're not using the service enough. If you keep the contract going, if you keep the dialogue going, inevitably good things will happen that otherwise would not have happened. And some of those good things can be, maybe they're paying less money, maybe they're your smallest clients, but they're appreciative that you let them be the smallest clients. And they reach out to some of their friends, or one of their friends comes to them and says, how have you handled this situation? They say, oh, this guy, Kevin, this guy, Dave, that I work with, they're great. I'd happy to be put you in touch with them. You're not likely to get that opportunity if you no longer have a contract with them and they discontinue. It may happen, but the likelihood reduces dramatically. While you have an active relationship in place, even if it's small potatoes, it allows for that opportunity to happen. Similarly, it allows for you to buy time for the right opportunity or the right window to strike. So if you keep the electricity turned on, you don't allow them, so to speak, to cancel or quit the contract. It buys you months, it buys you years to reset the footing, to get them on the right trajectory, and then blow up the relationship for that optimal outcome once you get that opportunity. But again, if the contract cancels, if it lapses, if they discontinue, there is no chance to blow them up. There is no chance to ride the wave or to wait until that wave comes. So it's a lot of work to get clients. It's a lot of work to service them. Keep them on board once you got them. I think, well, there's a quote in The Office that BJ Novak communicates to Michael Scott. The opportunity cost of signing on a new client versus keeping one you have. And he is right. So keep them once you have them. One of the other final closing thoughts, I really, really like this one. And I sometimes forget about it, and it takes the team that I've kind of taught to remind me in certain circumstances. But if you have the opportunity, take advantage of the uncommon shorter contract option. So frequently we have these conversations and we get into our standard default of, okay, we do 1-year contracts, we do 2-year contracts, we do 3 years, we do 6 months. Sometimes you're going to lose those conversations. It's not attractive to them for a variety of reasons. They're in a down period. They haven't been making money. They've been sick. They haven't used the service a lot, whatever it might be. Sometimes it's just the dollar amount. They're waiting for an influx from a nice investment or for winning a project, whatever it might be. Buy the time to get to that opportune window where you can have them spending what they should be and get them back on your standard contracts. The uncommon shorter contract is a great, great contract. Some people call it a bridge contract, really just to get you through a period where otherwise your default standard contract is something that is being received unfavorably. Lastly, build some personal capital with your relationships and with your primary contact. I can't tell you the amount of times after doing probably thousands of renewals over the past 12 years or so, many of those times, despite my best efforts, the firm's activity and their spend really does not warrant or justify them continuing. They just didn't use the service enough, and we're expensive, and damn, we're probably going to lose these folks. However, if you've built up a nice personal rapport and friendly relationship with them, they've seen you work maybe after hours or put in the extra effort or craft up nice emails for them or send them usage reports or breaking down the data for them, they feel an inevitable and subconscious sense of being beholden to you and that you care about them. And I can't tell you the amount of times where just based off their relationship alone, the firm or the contact said, Dave, yeah, we'll work something out. I like you. I like working with you. You know, I normally may not continue under these circumstances, but I think that we'll work it out. And it absolutely has a foundation in the personal relationship that has been built. So build that personal capital. And again, don't be disingenuous, or I encourage you not to, but you can absolutely use that to your advantage.
Hey, Dave, on a related note to that, Ryan Modi here asks, first he says, thanks for this, very helpful. But then he asks, what's a good approach when you learn at the time of renewal that the primary contact to discuss the renewal is a different person that you don't know?
Good question. Of course, you should try to find that out as early as you can so you're not absolutely blindsided. I would recommend you speak with your allies at the firm as quickly as possible, get a little bit of intelligence on who that decision maker is, why they're in the decision-making capacity. I would be communicating with the individual who did the last agreement with you. If it's not this person, if you talk to the person who did the last agreement with you, more often than not, you probably have a pretty good rapport with them or her. I mean, you shook hands and you signed a contract with them, so you at least had a meeting of the minds. I've found that using some of that personal historical relationship can be valuable in these circumstances. Oftentimes there may even be, it's not always, but maybe there's a little bit of animosity or they feel slighted that the responsibility has been taken away from them. And they want to communicate to you and kind of vent that frustration or give you some intelligence that will be valuable for you. You know, it's again kind of human nature. They want to see themselves have had a better negotiating experience in the eyes of their boss than the other person who has now supplanted them. So I would encourage you to employ those tactics. And again, if you find that out, or not again, but if you find that out late in the game, that's where you can use timing to your advantage. You know, push the conversation out. You got blindsided with some new intelligence. Don't go into that conversation unprepared. You're the one who's going to be sacrificing money, not them, if you extend it out. So it's up to you to make that decision. Maybe you get the money in a couple of weeks or a couple months later, but don't go into those conversations with unknown quantities unprepared. It would be my advice.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I want to throw out this one, at least I want to make sure that, that you get a chance to talk about underlings in part, Dave, because I know you and I know many of the things that you're talking about, by the way, which are like cultivating a community inside your own firm, cultivating as allies as assets on the other side, that you're uniquely good at them. But you don't actually have to just be an amazingly talented networker or a charmer to pull that stuff off. It's a little around process. And you had this in your notes. I want to make sure that it gets shared because to me, this is process. It's like how, if you're not a charmer or a natural networker, do you actually cultivate people? And I like this point.
Yep. So this is the kind of the final piece here. So a couple of thoughts on underlings. I really like this. And it sounds kind of self-explanatory and obvious, but most salespeople do not employ this. Spend time with the underlings, get to know them well. Get yourself, or I'd recommend you get yourself in a position where they know your first name. Again, just think about how these conversations are being had. You know, if there's the decision maker who you have the conversation with and you say, here's what I'm proposing, here are the 2 or 3 proposals. They say, great, I'm going to go back and speak with my team internally. Think about how that actually transpires. What happens is they sit in a room together and they say, okay, this guy Dave made these 3 proposals to us. What's your experience been like? Should we do it? Here's what the dollar amount they're asking for is. If you think about it, when these folks are saying, well, I actually kind of like the service, and Dave reached out to me on this, and Dave reached out to me on that, and Sarah on the research team, she did a great job on this case, and she gave me a call when I wasn't even thinking about the service, and they actually delivered the goods on that. Just think about that impact that that has when they're using your first name. Oftentimes the underlings are the ones that know you even better. They're the ones who consume the service, as opposed to your once a year or twice a year, 3 times a year conversation to negotiate the contract or do a semi-annual check-in or something like that. So get them comfortable with your first name. Again, a small little tidbit. I'd always encourage you to share your cell phone, to put that in emails as well, if you're willing to do so. But I do this in nearly every email that has anything to do with money. At the end, I say, please feel free to let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Please don't hesitate to email, call, or text me anytime. Here is my number. It's really akin to that first name type of concept, familiarity. And when you start getting text messages from a client, you know that you've passed the historical barrier of professional only relationship. There's a personal rapport that's in there. And the secondary part of the underling thing is they're oftentimes surprisingly receptive and forthcoming when you have conversations with them. I don't know if this is too uncouth to say, but when you think about it, it's, oftentimes they're similar to, the ugly duckling that's sitting there at prom or at the dance or whatever it is, who's not getting attention. And you're the big handsome guy or the big beautiful gal who's going over while they're sitting in the darkness by themselves and saying, hey, come dance with me. I'd like to get out in the spotlight center floor with you. It makes them feel good, especially if you have these conversations and dialogue with their boss, the head honcho at the firm. They think you're important. And when you show them a little bit of love and attention, all of a sudden it makes them feel important too. They're much more forthcoming. They trust you with what would otherwise maybe be a little more confidential information or details or intelligence that they're keeping closer to the vest. And you'll really pull some nuggets. It's comparable to the allies, speaking with allies and speaking with your research or your colleagues who are servicing the firm. But the underlings can play such a critical role of having critical mass with them if there's a lot of them, or at least providing you some insights at a bare minimum that are going to prove critical in your negotiations.
Well, Dave, we gotta cut it. We're at time. Now we left about a page and a half extra bonus material, so we may have to get you back again in order to give this another cut and chop some more wood together. But I wanted to say a special thanks. I know you're staying up very late your time, so I appreciate that by itself. But more importantly, just sharing some wisdom that doesn't come from reading a couple of books or going on a couple of pitches. It takes 12 years to understand the kinds of things that you're sharing with the crew. Just by way of contact, how can people reach you when they want to?
Please don't hesitate to email, call, or text me if you have any questions or concerns on my cell phone. Please feel free to distribute my email if anybody wants to catch up after or later this week or next week. I'm passionate about sales and I can go on and on about it. And I love helping others who are, on their sales path. So happy to speak with really anyone if they would like to set aside some time. So please distribute my email.
Superb. And if people want to get in touch with Sage, it's sage.exchange, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Well, good night, Dave. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me. Have a great afternoon.